Now, when it comes to buying watches from China, I think there's a lot of options. There's some rather average watches, there's a lot of good watches, there's definitely some great watches, but then there's watches which I think are even better. Watches that I think are absolutely incredible. And I try to reserve this thought only to the best watches that I've ever come across from China. And I've had a few in my collections. I've still got one or two of them in my collection. And this Baltany that I'm going to share with you today deserves to be on that list. Hello, you're watching James. My name's James, you're watching me, and I am talking about watches, and I'm talking about another Baltany watch. And I say another Baltany watch because I've owned a few already. And all the other Baltany watches that I have owned have all been absolutely amazing. They've been fantastic. Some of the best watches that I've owned from China, but none of them have been as good as this one. This one is by far the best from Baltany that I have experienced. In fact, it's probably one of the single best watches that I've experienced from China. And when I say that, I also mean sort of watches from microbrands and all sorts of other places, because this watch really is worthwhile considering because it is only 260 Australian dollars. Now, I bought this one myself a little while ago. I've been wearing this one a lot in the last few months. And I've been really excited to now share with you those experiences that I've had with this watch and why I think it is so good. And if you are going to buy one, well, I am going to leave one of those affiliate links down to the store that I bought this watch from myself. So thank you if you choose to use that. But there's going to be some options for you. I chose to go through the silver dial. Now it says white dial on the listing, but it actually looks more silver. And you can get that silver dial or that white dial with both an automatic or a manual movement. But there's also a salmon dial, which I think looks great as well, but I just do like this sort of silver white dial. And of course you can get that one in the automatic or the manual wind version only. Now I chose to buy the automatic version, and I may have made a mistake there. I think perhaps the manual would be the one I would recommend now. And the reason I say that is for two reasons. Firstly, this is probably not a watch that you're going to wear every single day. So being automatic is a little bit of sort of redundant because I don't need to keep it wound up because I'm not wearing it day in, day out. But secondly, by having the manual wind-up version only versus the automatic, it makes it even a little bit thinner. Now this is already a thin watch, but because it has this sort of dressy vintage style to it, being even thinner would be a little bit nicer on top of what it already is. So I'm going to say right now, if you're considering buying this one, I would definitely consider the manual winder version. This case as well, this sort of style comes in a couple of other variations as well, but I'm going to be concentrating on this one because this is the one that I bought with this particular style of movement. But let's check it out in a little bit more detail because it is worth checking out in a little bit more detail. Let's start with the dimensions, shall we? Because this is a case diameter of 38.5 millimeters. It has a height of 10.7, and as I said, this is the automatic, so it's even a little bit thinner if you decide to go for the mechanical only. A lug-to-lug of 43.8, meaning this watch is going to fit a lot of people's wrists, and it has a lug width of 20, which is a nice standard amount, and a weight on this supplied leather strap of 70 grams. Now, when I first got this watch and I put it on my wrist, I was a little bit concerned that perhaps this leather strap was not going to stay on it. But as it's turned out, it's ended up being a really good strap, so I haven't ended up changing it out. And I have worn this watch a lot. And you'll see on my wrist now that these dimensions, because of it being a square watch, actually sits really nice on wrist. So don't be worried about that smaller lug-to-lug or even the case dimensions. It is a watch that I think is going to suit a lot of people's wrists. Now, of course, it's pretty obvious that the 12 o'clock is not at the 12 o'clock. It is shifted across in more like a sort of vintage driver's style. Now, I'm going to admit that this has caught me out a couple of times wearing this watch when I've just glanced to check the time and I haven't really paid attention to that offset and I've got the time wrong, but it's not really a big issue, it's just being aware of that. And I'm now aware of that when I wear this watch. But let's look at this dial because the quality of this watch is absolutely fantastic, and you see that from this dial. You can see it is a slight sort of textured or at least a sparkle sort of finish to the dial. As I said, it's more of a silver than a white, even though it's listed as a white. But it's the numbers, those numerals that really stand out to me. They are applied, they are a great sort of format or a great sort of font, but the quality of them, how they're sort of cut out, I can't really sort of fathom how they've been able to make this watch at this price with details like this, and I think they look great. All gloss, of course, and those hands. I love the hands on this watch. They are funky and weird. Maybe they're more of a vintage style, I don't know, but I just like how they look, especially that minute hand. I think how it sort of dips in at the middle, then goes back out again to the end. I like it. I think it suits this watch. And I like then that there's a little bit of color on this dial with that sub-second hand. It is blue. Now, I'm not sure if it's blued. I probably don't think it probably is, but I just like it anyway because it's nice to have that little bit of flash of blue on this dial. Now, everything else that is on this watch is printed on in black, including that second track around that little sub-second, the minute track around the outside, and that Baltany logo. And I'm going to say right now that that Baltany logo doesn't look right, or at least I think it could be improved. It is the only thing about this watch, in fact, that I think could be improved. I've got no problem with the Baltany name. I think that's just a standard font of Baltany is okay, but it sort of seems like an afterthought on this particular watch. I think perhaps it needs to be maybe an applied logo there or something, but it just feels maybe a little bit small. It kind of just feels like an afterthought. It hasn't taken away from me liking this watch or enjoying it or wearing this watch, but I think a lot of you may be looking at this watch and see it even before I've mentioned it, and it really did stand out to me. So pointing it out whilst I'm talking about the dial, but the watch itself, or the dial itself, is then covered by a sapphire crystal. It has a very slight double dome to it, but I'm not sure if it's completely flat or just a very slight. I think it might be slightly double domed. Then the case itself, all polished. Nothing more really to say about that. It's a nice size style of case. It sort of suits this watch, obviously, but all polished. But then, of course, that crown, which is at the 12 o'clock, which is not at the 12 o'clock, but it is actually at the 12 o'clock, but it's off to the right, if you know what I mean. And I'm sure you do by looking at the watch. So that's a little bit of an interesting factor to this one as well, a little bit different and quite nice to have there. The lugs are very cool, very vintage style. Obviously, it's designed for this style of watch. Now, if you're not already aware, this is not an original design watch. This is actually a watch that is homaging a much more expensive watch. A very beautiful watch, but a much more expensive watch. And I think this sort of idea of a homage is really good because the original watch is completely outside the price range of almost everybody that buys watches. So this is where a good homage makes sense. There is no argument for save up for the original for this one. None at all. Because unless you're going to spend $50,000 on a watch, then I think perhaps this $250 something watch might be a better option for you. And I've actually tried on the $50,000 watch and it is beautiful. It really is lovely. But I'm going to say that the Baltany gives me the same sort of feel. It certainly looks very similar on wrist. It feels very similar on wrist. And I actually enjoy it just as much, well, almost just as much as that one I tried on. But I can actually afford this one. I'm never going to spend 50 grand on a watch, way outside of my price range. So it's nice to be able to then have this option because it's a beautiful looking watch and I've been really enjoying wearing this Baltany. It's one that I've really been going towards and wearing in lots of different situations. It does kind of look like a dress watch because of that sort of vintage sort of style to it, but I think this one can be worn way outside of that. And let's look at that strap again because, as I mentioned, initially I wasn't sure if it was going to be good enough for this watch. But as it's turned out, it's been good enough for this watch. I love the color of it. I like the quality of it. I think the hardware matches very well with the case itself, and I haven't swapped it out. And as I keep mentioning, I've worn this one a lot, and I had the option to swap it out, and I've chosen not to. So it is worthwhile being aware that it's a good strap that comes with this Baltany. Now, looking at the back of this watch, you'll see that it is a screw-on case back. That gives it 50 meters of water resistance. And inside this one is a ST1701 automatic movement. And I've already mentioned a couple of times, but I would recommend going for the manual. I think that sort of winding up experience with this one, having it very slightly thinner as well, would likely be a better choice. Or at least it probably would have been for me if I thought it through a little bit more. And I think it really does look good on my wrist, my 17 centimeter wrist. It's just nice to have a different watch in my collection as well, and a beautiful watch and a beautifully well-made watch. But what do I like about this one? What don't I like about it? And what would I change? Well, the first thing has to be the quality. It really does amaze me how well made this watch is for the price that this watch does cost. But it's also the style and the looks. I think it's a very cool looking watch. Those applied markers, and in particular those hands on this watch, are really a standout feature for me. But unfortunately that logo does take away from this one a little bit. I think they could have improved upon that, and it certainly is something that I would have changed. I think maybe just a sort of applied polished logo would have probably satisfied me, and I think it would have made this watch look even better than it is. And I can certainly say this particular watch, if you like the look of it, I can 100% recommend it to you because it is one of the best I have purchased and owned myself. And when I wear a watch as much as I've worn this one, it does tell me something about it. Now, if you're a little bit unsure about that movement, however, or you don't like the sub-second registry, there's another variation of this watch too that comes with the 9000 series Miyota high beat movement, which I almost bought because I do love that particular movement, but it is a little bit more expensive and it doesn't have that sub-second registry, and they're the two reasons why I chose this one. There's a potential that I might actually go and now buy the Miyota version of it because I actually enjoy this watch so much, but there's also some other watches coming out from Baltany that have this kind of feel and look to it as well, and they're on my radar too. But whilst we wait for me to buy those and spend more of my money on watches, well, maybe you might watch a couple more of my videos. Maybe even these two.